Hey guys, tonight we settle into something a little darker than usual. You step quietly into the room with me, the glow of your screen softening the edges of the shadows around you, and already you feel like you've walked into the wrong story. There's this low hum in the air, maybe from your fan, maybe from whatever is breathing behind you. I'm kidding. Mostly. And honestly, if you stick around for tonight's topic, you probably won't survive this, but that's fine. It's a YouTube video. Your ghost can finish it if necessary. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing who's out there staying up way too late. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander forward, feeling the air thicken as the world of the present loosens its grip and history pulls you in by the wrist. It's not the clean, museum glass version of history, you know, the one where everyone talks in polite tones and the worst thing that happens is somebody's wig gets powdered wrong. No, tonight you're drifting into the territory where crowns weigh more than skulls can tolerate and mercy is a luxury stored away for special occasions, like fancy china no one ever uses. You move along a dim corridor, one of those long, echoing hallways that seems too narrow for comfort yet somehow too wide to feel safe. Every step you take becomes part of the story, like the floorboards have been waiting centuries for someone nosy enough to walk on them. You can almost sense faces lingering just outside your peripheral vision, queens whose names you might know, whose portraits you've probably seen without realizing how disturbingly cruel their reigns actually were. Your mind flickers to the kind of historical stories people tell at parties. Stuff like, oh, she was a powerful ruler, or, she was a patron of the arts. But here, in the quiet of this late-night wandering, you feel the weight of everything those polite descriptions leave out, the betrayals, the punishments, the very intentional terror that kept entire kingdoms trembling. Because every crown has a backstory, and some are soaked so deeply in suffering that even centuries later, you swear you can smell the iron in the air. As you drift deeper, you notice how the silence feels staged, like the world is holding its breath just long enough for you to get uneasy. And you do get uneasy, right about the time you realize that some of the cruelest queens in history weren't born monsters. They were shaped, squeezed, cornered, and sharpened by the kinds of circumstances that would break most of us before breakfast. That's the uncomfortable part. You see how the path from victim to villain is sometimes just a matter of one really bad decade. A mainstream fact nudges at you from the shadows, one of those you learned at some point. Catherine de' Medici really did keep an elite group of female spies known as the Flying Squadron. You picture them slipping through halls, blending beauty with espionage, and you wonder how many secrets were stolen before anyone realized what was happening. But the thought lingers in your mind like a rumor whispered behind a fan, because power, especially in royal courts, was never clean. You let your step soften as you move toward a faint glow. Maybe it's a candle, maybe it's something else. The flame wavers, the shadows bend, and you think about how cruelty in queens is always examined under this weirdly harsher microscope than cruelty in kings. Scholars still argue whether the stories of female brutality were exaggerated, because male historians needed villains who wore dresses. Yet, as you keep walking, the darkness feels too dense for exaggeration. Some of these women earned their reputations the hard way. A chill grazes your neck as something brushes past, probably just a draft, probably. But you look over your shoulder anyway. Because if tonight has taught you anything already, it's that the past loves an audience. And you're the only one here. You inch forward and come across an odd detail, the kind you wouldn't expect. Some royal courts used trained dwarfs as living table ornaments, positioned to amuse, decorate, or serve as curiosities for foreign guests. You imagine one standing silently beside a cruel queen's throne, trying to read her expression, trying to predict her mood on days when the slightest mistake could change a life forever. And you realize how power warps every room it enters. Your breathing slows a little as you become aware of how these queens controlled more than armies, they controlled atmospheres. One gesture from them, and the temperature in a hall could drop like someone opened a window to midwinter. The people closest to them weren't influenced by loyalty or admiration but by fear so persistent it seeped into daily routines, shaping how they walked, talked, even inhaled. You imagine yourself standing in one of those courts, trying to speak while a queen's cold eyes rest on you, waiting for you to slip. Your steps keep carrying you through the corridor, but something subtle changes. The walls start displaying scenes, not paintings, not carvings, but memories. When you glance at the first one, it flickers. A young queen sits alone on a bed too large for her, the silence pressing down on her like a punishment. She's not cruel yet, not even close, but you can tell she's learning something dangerous, that no one is coming to save her, and that the world only listens when she makes it bleed. You keep moving, and the memories shift. Another queen appears, older now, seated on a throne carved from a single block of dark wood. Her expression is unreadable, but her hands tell the story, steady, precise, unshaking. You almost admire her, until you notice the man kneeling at her feet, trembling, waiting for her judgment. You watch her raise a finger, just one, and the tiny movement sends guards rushing forward to drag him away. You don't see what happens next, but her faint smile tells you enough. As you drift past, the corridor hums like a living organism. It knows you're listening, and it wants you to keep listening. The floor beneath you feels warmer now, like the stories themselves are heating up, becoming sharper, preparing you for the queens whose shadows you'll follow next. But you don't rush. You let the tension settle into your shoulders the way late-night stories always do, slowly, quietly, insistently. You feel the weight of the journey ahead. 15 sections of stepping deeper into the lives of queens who could silence an entire banquet hall with nothing but a raised eyebrow. Queens who weren't intimidated by cruelty, they wielded it like a favorite accessory. The corridor around you begins to stretch into something wider, darker, almost cathedral-like. Candles flicker in tall iron holders, and the air smells slightly metallic, like dust mixed with memory. Your footsteps echo loudly now. Too loudly. You pause to steady your breath, even though you know the sound won't stay steady for long. Because you can feel her, the first cruel queen of this journey, watching from a place just out of sight. Your pulse quickens, not from fear exactly, but from that strange curiosity that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., watching videos you know will ruin your sleep schedule. You take a step forward anyway, because that's the thing about curiosity. It doesn't care about survival instincts. You straighten your shoulders, inhale deeply, and follow the corridor as it bends into a gentle curve, one that feels almost deliberate, like it's guiding you, preparing you. And as the glow ahead brightens, you sense the beginning of the stories that have waited centuries for someone reckless enough to listen this closely. They've been waiting for you. You step forward, still carrying the lingering chill from the first corridor, and you feel yourself entering the early lives of queens, those fragile, gilded beginnings that, strangely enough, often sow the seeds of cruelty. Imagine a cradle surrounded by velvet and gold, yet underneath, the air is thick with whispered expectations. You wander through these scenes, noticing how each small injustice or moment of neglect can twist into a lifetime of hardened resolve. You almost want to step in, to warn these young girls, but of course, you can't. Time doesn't bend for spectators. You just watch. Some queens were born into bloodlines where every lullaby was a lesson in survival. You see a child learning how to nod politely while plotting her escape from a cousin's jealous gaze. You picture tiny fingers tracing the edges of ancient manuscripts, memorizing not just poetry but genealogies, maps of alliances, betrayals, and who might die next. Scholars still argue whether these early pressures were crucial to forming a queen's mind or merely exaggerated tales for the sake of drama, but in this corridor, it doesn't matter. You feel the tension settle over you like the faint scent of old paper and cold stone. The odd details start nudging at your curiosity. You notice, for instance, that some royal nurseries were decorated with clocks ticking ominously, reminding children that every second counts, that delay can be fatal. You feel the peculiarity of it, how something meant to soothe, like the rhythm of a ticking clock, was weaponized to cultivate discipline, vigilance, and early anxiety. A tiny, cruel touch, but a touch that left impressions for life. A mainstream historical fact reaches out to you through the shadows. Mary, Queen of Scots, experienced political imprisonment almost from birth, growing up surrounded by tension between factions, each vying for her allegiance. You wander along the metaphorical corridors of her youth, sensing how formative these pressures were. Her ability to plan, manipulate, and respond with icy precision didn't emerge from thin air. Every whispered conspiracy, every fleeting betrayal from attendants or family shaped her like a sculptor chiseling marble. You pause to consider the social structures around these girls. Courtiers, tutors, wet nurses, they are all pieces of an invisible machinery designed to mold future rulers. The dynamics are strange, almost theatrical, love mixed with suspicion, guidance mixed with intimidation. You feel the unease of a child, aware that a misplaced glance might inspire punishment not of the body, but of the spirit. These are corridors filled with invisible traps, and as you wander, you can almost hear the faint creak of a misstep echoing across centuries. Your steps carry you past an oddly specific detail. Some princesses were educated in the art of reading facial expressions before they were allowed to read poetry. You imagine a tutor gesturing toward the royal staff, demanding, "See what lies behind their eyes," as though that insight alone could save a life. The connection between observation and survival is tangible here, you almost shiver. The absurdity, yet the necessity, is something you can't shake. You start noticing how early rivalries within families also set the stage for later cruelty. A slight from a sibling, a glance from a cousin, an insult from a nurse, small events, yes, but compounded across years. Scholars still argue whether these internalized conflicts were the principal drivers of later ruthlessness, or merely accessories to ambition. But right now, walking through these imagined nurseries, you feel it all pressing against you. The expectation to survive, the pressure to dominate, the knowledge that mercy is almost always a vulnerability. You wander into the corridors of training and discipline. Games or lessons, toys or tests, dolls or practice for diplomacy, strategy, and negotiation. You see tiny hands moving pieces across miniaturized battlefields, rehearsing the kinds of decisions that could one day send soldiers and servants alike to their deaths. You shiver as you realize how early cruelty can take root under the guise of education and play, and how even love, conditional, cautious, can plant seeds of harshness. A subtle, almost absurd oddity emerges from the shadows. Some royal children slept with guards stationed in the room, meant to protect them, yet also subtly remind them of the constant presence of authority and potential danger. You imagine a night punctuated by the soft clinking of armor and muffled whispers, the world outside and inside simultaneously protective and threatening. The duality of care and intimidation seems to seep into your own bones as you wander. You drift to the first glimpses of choice, moments when these young girls might exercise power, however minor, over their attendants or siblings. It's almost imperceptible, a refusal to obey, a clever retort, a silent manipulation, but you can sense it, the beginnings of what will later be considered cruelty. Scholars still argue whether these early assertions are instinctual or learned, yet for now, you merely observe the trajectory. Small control growing into an empire of influence, small fear blossoming into the capacity to command terror. You linger on one girl, perched on the edge of her bed, staring into a candle flame as if it might tell her the future. You feel her calculation, every action measured, every expression studied. Perhaps she knows already that mercy is optional, that cruelty is a tool, and that survival demands acuity, even at the cost of tenderness. You step closer but remain unseen, because the corridor doesn't allow intrusion. It only allows watching, absorbing, understanding. Finally, you feel the corridor widen as the narrative begins to shift. You sense that these formative experiences, the fears, the games, the silent teachings, are shaping figures whose cruelty will one day be legendary. And yet, you notice the human pulse beneath it all, the confusion, the vulnerability, the questions that linger even under the weight of crowns and expectations. You walk slowly, letting each moment resonate. The echoes of childhood strategy, manipulation, and early survival hum softly beneath your footsteps, creating a low, rhythmic tension that promises much darker corridors ahead. You step out of the corridors of childhood and into the moment when ambition crystallizes, when a crown isn't just a dream, it's a tool. The air here feels heavier, like it has been soaked in the quiet calculations of generations. You wander through palaces where the walls themselves seem to lean in, listening to every conversation, every whispered promise, every threat barely disguised as advice. You notice how fear becomes currency. The subject who trembles in your presence pays tribute not with gold, but with compliance. And you realize that some queens understood this from the moment their first coronation was whispered in their ears. Your mind drifts to the sheer variety of ways a throne could be won, or defended. Some queens inherited their power, slipping into their roles as if stepping into gloves too large, yet impeccably tailored. Others seized it, maneuvering through plots and betrayals, sometimes against family members whose faces were as familiar as their own reflection. Scholars still argue whether certain acts of cruelty were strategic or instinctual, but for you, wandering this shadowy space, the line is almost irrelevant. The effect is the same: authority enforced through fear. A mainstream historical fact nudges at you from the shadows. Elizabeth I of England consolidated her power not just through diplomacy but through calculated displays of intimidation, from her imposing wardrobe to her sharply timed appearances at court. You imagine the courtiers holding their breath as she glides past, her eyes sharp and evaluating, her presence a subtle weapon. Each gesture, each smile or frown, a carefully measured act of control. You can almost hear the quiet gasp of admiration mixed with fear, the kind that lingers long after the queen has moved on. Odd details appear like flickers along the walls. You notice how some rulers cultivated personal rituals to instill awe, or terror. One queen reportedly dined with servants staring at her in complete silence, forcing them to confront the enormity of her presence. You picture yourself at that table, aware that your next word, or even the wrong kind of bow, could shift her mood from benign to lethal. The absurdity of it is almost humorous, except the undercurrent of genuine danger keeps your pulse quickened. You drift down a hallway lined with portraits, each frame capturing a different queen whose rise involved the mastery of fear. You pause at one whose expression is almost playful, yet you sense the cold steel beneath the charm. You feel the tension of her court, the quiet terror that dictated every conversation. She smiled, yes, but her smile was a scalpel. Scholars still argue whether her cruelty was public performance or private necessity, but in this hall of memory, you can sense both. The duality hums softly against your ears, like the rhythm of a fan keeping you awake at 3 a.m. You notice the strategies these queens employed weren't always overt. Power could be displayed in subtle ways, a casual insult delivered to an important noble, a whispered suggestion that a rival had misbehaved, a delay in reward that communicated control. You imagine each of these small acts as pebbles dropped into a pond, ripples spreading across the court. And you realize the most effective cruelty isn't always bloody, it's psychological. You shiver, understanding that the mind, once bent toward fear, can be even more malleable than the body. A peculiar detail catches your attention. Some queens used ceremonial gestures to reinforce their dominance, such as insisting that visitors approach with elaborate bows or remain silent until spoken to. You see the tension in those movements, the subtle anxiety transmitted by posture alone. It's strange to think of power conveyed through etiquette, yet it works. The corridors echo faintly with the soft shuffle of feet and the nervous breaths of courtiers, past and present mingling in an uneasy harmony. You wander further into the dynamics of succession. Rival claimants, discontented nobles, ambitious relatives, these were the chess pieces of power, and the queens you follow moved with a ruthless precision that almost feels unnatural. Scholars still argue whether these maneuvers were truly cold-blooded or merely necessary acts of survival in a brutal system. But as you walk, you sense that whatever the motivation, the outcome was unmistakable: control enforced, opposition neutralized, fear solidified as part of the social fabric. You feel yourself brushing against moments where power is intertwined with spectacle. A queen might stage public punishments, orchestrate displays of loyalty, or flaunt wealth in ways designed to remind everyone that she is untouchable. These are theatrical acts, yes, but every performance carries weight. You imagine the whispers, the cautious glances exchanged among courtiers, the quiet dread woven into every polished floorboard. The corridor begins to bend, narrowing slightly, guiding you toward an unseen doorway. You sense that the next stage of this journey will reveal not just the acquisition of fear, but the full mastery of it. You pause for a moment, taking in the atmosphere, the chill, the faint metallic scent in the air, the subtle tension vibrating under your skin. You inhale deeply, aware that the steps ahead will lead deeper into the psyche of queens who transformed cruelty into a tool of governance, who understood that sometimes, survival demanded more than cunning, it demanded ruthlessness. And as you prepare to step through, you notice a small, almost humorous oddity lingering at the edge of perception. Some queens reportedly had pets that mirrored their own temperament, animals trained to intimidate visitors or symbolize power. You can't help but picture a snarling dog or a hissing cat perched nearby as courtiers approached. The absurdity of it softens the edge of fear just enough for you to continue, curious, cautious, and completely absorbed. You step beyond the threshold and find yourself wandering through the halls and chambers where cruelty is no longer a possibility. It is a language spoken fluently, one that resonates through the silent corners of the palace. The air feels thick here, carrying the faint scent of wax, wood polish, and perhaps something darker, the lingering memory of terror. As you walk, you notice that every door, every curtain, every gilded frame has a story attached, some whispered, some shouted, some never uttered aloud at all. You're not just a spectator, you feel yourself being pulled into the rhythm of these courts, where even a hesitant glance can carry consequences. You drift into a grand salon where whispers and rumors are the currency of survival. You see courtiers exchanging careful nods, hiding trepidation behind polite smiles. The faint shimmer of sunlight through stained glass paints colored patterns on the marble floor, but it doesn't warm the room, it only highlights the tension, like light exposing cracks in a perfectly polished surface. Scholars still argue whether this constant atmosphere of suspicion-shaped cruelty in queens are merely magnified tendencies already present, but here, among the echoes, it feels inseparable from daily life. A mainstream historical fact intrudes into your wandering thoughts. Anne Boleyn's court was notoriously unforgiving, with nobles constantly maneuvering to gain her favor, or avoid her wrath. You picture the tension in the air as small missteps became monumental, alliances forming and dissolving in silent exchanges. The subtle cruelty here isn't always measured in blood, it's in the trembling hands, the forced smiles, the perpetual fear that someone's carefully cultivated career could vanish overnight. You shiver just imagining it. Odd details emerge like faint scratches in the wallpaper. You notice that some queens had secret chambers where they could retreat, observing their court unseen. From these hidden vantage points, they could watch, interpret, and manipulate. You almost expect a small trapdoor or peephole to appear beneath your feet, as if you've stepped into one of those private surveillance points. The strangeness reminds you that power isn't just exerted, it's crafted, carefully curated, and maintained like a living organism. You wander down a hall lined with tapestries depicting past victories and conquests, yet each image carries an undercurrent of menace. You sense the messages woven into these images: obedience is rewarded, defiance punished, and all eyes are always on the throne. You notice how subtle gestures, an extended hand, a tilt of the head, a sharp glance, could communicate approval or warning to a room full of people, each one acutely aware that a misjudgment could cost them dearly. A peculiar, almost absurd anecdote nudges at your mind. Some queens reportedly insisted that guests at court perform elaborate rituals of flattery, bowing multiple times or reciting intricate verses before a word was exchanged. You imagine the awkward tension as courtiers try to remember which bow signals loyalty versus which signifies ignorance. The humor is faint, almost cruel in itself, but it underscores how psychological mastery often outweighed physical punishment in these chambers. You sense a shift as you move past a long row of portraits. Cruelty here is both ritualized and theatrical. Some queens staged punishments for maximum effect, ensuring that lessons were learned and fear reinforced. You feel the power of spectacle as a tool: a public whipping, a humiliating display, a dramatic arrest. You imagine the courtiers holding their breath, the room vibrating with tension, all eyes tracking a ruler's every motion. Scholars still argue whether such spectacles were primarily for control or entertainment, yet the sensation of dread remains real, palpable even now. The hall curves, leading you into a more intimate chamber where whispers become sharper. You feel the influence of private cruelty, the sort that leaves no scars but lingers in memory. You imagine a queen speaking in measured tones, letting insinuation and suggestion do the work of swords, carving anxiety into her audience. The subtlety is striking: a phrase delivered with precision, a look lingering just long enough, a sigh weighted with meaning. You sense the invisible threads connecting mind to mind, each subject acutely aware of the consequences of misreading their sovereign. Another odd detail emerges from the shadows. Some queens reportedly had attendants trained specifically to anticipate reactions, acting as extensions of their will. You picture them moving quietly, adjusting the environment to reflect the queen's mood, shifting objects, and signaling readiness. It's an eerie dance, choreographed to maintain absolute control, reminding you that cruelty isn't always overt, it's sometimes embedded in the very structure of daily life. The palace itself seems to lean in as you move. You notice the subtleties of architecture designed to impress or intimidate: high ceilings that swallow sound, narrow stairways that force deferential posture, corridors that amplify every footstep. Even the way light filters through windows is purposeful, casting shadows that exaggerate the presence of authority. Walking through this space, you can almost feel the pressure applied not just by individuals but by the environment itself, a psychological tool designed to maintain obedience. Finally, you pause at a doorway leading deeper into the private chambers, where the combination of fear and strategy intensifies. You sense the personal cruelty here, the kind practiced behind closed doors, shaping both rulers and subjects alike. You feel the palpable tension, the lingering threat, the subtle games that could ruin careers, or lives. And as you linger, you realize the truth: cruelty is a language these queens mastered early, refined over years, and wielded as effortlessly as any scepter or crown. You step forward, feeling the weight of centuries pressing on your shoulders, knowing that the queens you're about to encounter next will show you how cruelty extends beyond fear, beyond spectacle. It becomes a way of life, a method of control that shapes entire nations. One carefully measured action at a time. You move deeper, your footsteps softer now, almost reverent, because the next part of this journey isn't about politics or ceremony, it's about punishment, raw and deliberate. The air here carries an almost metallic tang, like iron or blood lingering in memory, and the echo of movement feels heavier, laden with consequences. You wander into chambers where cruelty was codified, not whispered, punishments designed not just to discipline, but to etch lessons into the very minds and bodies of those who dared oppose a queen's will. Your mind drifts to the idea of corporal punishment, but you quickly realize that the cruelest acts often avoided direct violence. A glare, a carefully timed insult, a denial of food or comfort, small instruments of terror wielded by rulers who understood psychology better than any general. Scholars still argue whether these subtle torments were more effective than public displays of brutality, but you feel the answer in the air. Fear, once internalized, can be far more binding than chains. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your awareness. Empress Dowager Sachhi of China reportedly maintained strict control over her court through punishments that ranged from exile within the palace to the stripping of rank and privileges, creating a web of psychological tension. You picture the courtiers navigating her intricate rules, avoiding missteps that might ruin them permanently. Even today, it seems cruel to imagine the constant vigilance required just to survive daily life around such a ruler. Odd details appear like shadows at the edge of your vision. Some queens imposed punishments that doubled as spectacle, for instance, arranging for offenders to serve at feasts in humiliating roles or forcing them to perform menial tasks while the court watched. You almost smile at the absurdity, but it's tempered by the realization that each act reinforces the hierarchy, trains obedience, and deepens fear. Theatrics and cruelty merge seamlessly here, becoming indistinguishable. You wander past corridors lined with subtle reminders, tapestries depicting both triumph and suffering, inscriptions reminding subjects that obedience is rewarded and disobedience punished. The faint rustle of silk on stone floors amplifies the tension, the whispers of attendants moving quietly in anticipation of the queen's mood. Scholars still argue whether the dramatization of punishment was primarily for public impression or personal satisfaction, yet as you move along, you feel the oppressive weight of both purposes entwined. You drift toward the personal chambers of a queen, where punishments were often private and psychological. You picture a chambermaid trembling, aware that a missed chore or misplaced word could earn her a week of silent treatment or demotion. It's strange to think that silence itself could hurt more than any lash or branding iron. And yet, here, in the quiet corridors of imagination, you feel it, the slow, insidious shaping of fear that extends from mind to body. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens had attendants trained to interpret moods, signaling when even a fleeting expression might invite reprimand. You imagine these unseen orchestrators moving like shadows, correcting posture, whispering reminders, adjusting seating, all to ensure that punishment, subtle or overt, maintains its full effect. The subtle cruelty is everywhere, interwoven into daily life, almost invisible yet impossible to escape. You sense the rhythm of enforcement, unpredictability heightens fear. Punishments could be immediate or delayed, public or private, large or small. You feel the unease as you imagine never knowing when your next action might bring consequence. This unpredictability is itself a tool, a cruel instrument that teaches caution, calculation, and obedience. You realize the queen who mastered it held a kind of absolute authority, bending not just events but perception itself. The corridor narrows slightly, guiding you past portraits of those who fell victim to such punishments. Some images are restrained, others exaggerated, but the effect is consistent. The viewer feels the terror even centuries later. You pause, sensing how memory and art combine to cement reputations of cruelty, ensuring that lessons extended beyond the moment of punishment into the realm of legend. Another odd detail flickers at the edges of your awareness. Some rulers maintained intricate schedules of punishments, almost like appointments in a calendar, ensuring that fear was ritualized and consistent. You imagine attending such a court, your mind constantly calculating, second-guessing every gesture, every word. The precision of it feels almost clinical, yet it's undeniably human, a methodical shaping of behavior through observation, anticipation, and consequence. Finally, you feel the slow, inevitable realization settling in. The cruelty you witness here isn't random. It's structured, purposeful, and profoundly effective. Each act, each punishment, each whisper or glare is part of a larger architecture of power. And as you step forward, you carry the sense that the queens who mastered this art didn't merely punish. They educated, manipulated, and controlled in ways that extended far beyond the immediate, leaving long shadows over entire courts and generations. You drift onward, deeper into the labyrinth of cruelty, and now your path leads you to the heart of rivalry. This isn't just punishment for disobedience anymore, it's deliberate elimination of anyone who might challenge the throne. You feel the tension thicken around you, like the air itself has learned to whisper threats. Every glance between courtiers could be fatal, every smile hiding a dagger, literal or metaphorical. You wander through corridors where ambition and fear are inseparable, and you realize that surviving here is as much about perception as it is about skill. You notice how these queens perfected the art of neutralizing threats. Rivals weren't just removed, they were carefully manipulated, isolated, or humiliated. Scholars still argue whether these acts were political necessities or expressions of personal cruelty, but the effect remains, power reinforced by the silent terror of potential enemies. You feel yourself tensing, imagining the whispered plots, the hidden letters, the secret alliances that could crumble at the wrong moment. A mainstream historical fact nudges your awareness. Elizabeth Báthory, the infamous Hungarian noblewoman, allegedly orchestrated the systematic torment of young women within her estates, often targeting servants and rivals under the guise of punishment or protection. You picture the intricate schemes, the constant evaluation of loyalty, and the meticulous calculation that goes into identifying threats. Even centuries later, the idea of calculated cruelty sends a shiver down your spine. Odd details flicker like candlelight along the walls. Some queens reportedly staged elaborate social manipulations, arranging marriages, alliances, and appearances to subtly undermine rivals while boosting their own standing. You imagine the careful choreography. One misstep and a carefully constructed plan collapses, leaving the perpetrator vulnerable to ridicule, exile, or worse. The absurdity of it, the almost theatrical complexity, makes you marvel at how strategic cruelty can become. You wander past portraits and tapestries depicting noble families, each thread a reminder of the precariousness of position. You sense the silent battles being fought behind closed doors, whispers exchanged over tea, gestures that seemed innocent but carried coded threats, and favors granted only to those deemed trustworthy. Scholars still debate how much of this behavior was learned from observation versus innate cunning, but as you walk, you can see the patterns, fear and rivalry intertwining seamlessly. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens maintained spy networks, composed of attendants, confidants, and even children, whose observations ensured that no action went unnoticed. You imagine yourself slipping into one of these secret networks, notes hidden in folds of fabric, whispered messages passed with perfect discretion. The sophistication of these systems is staggering, blending psychological control with strategic foresight, and you feel the slow creeping awareness that in such courts, every move matters. You sense the subtle terror of misjudging loyalty. A wrong word, a poorly timed bow, or an unguarded glance could result in exile, imprisonment, or loss of status. You realize that cruelty in these contexts isn't always loud or violent, it's strategic, surgical, and often invisible to outsiders. The queen doesn't need to strike. She simply needs to position her subjects in a web of tension where fear becomes instinctive. The corridor narrows slightly as you approach chambers where conspiracies were unraveled and rivals quietly disposed of. You feel the anticipation, the careful choreography of rumor and reputation. You imagine letters intercepted, secret passages used, and allies carefully courted while enemies were isolated. It's a delicate dance, requiring patience, intelligence, and a willingness to act decisively, and often ruthlessly. Oddly, some rulers employed psychological tests for rivals, creating scenarios where loyalty could be demonstrated, or failure exposed, in dramatic fashion. You picture a noble kneeling, unsure of whether to obey or hesitate, with the queen observing silently. Scholars still debate whether these tests were genuinely necessary or tools to maintain absolute dominance, but the tension in the air tells you everything you need to know. Survival depended on understanding, anticipating, and sometimes outmaneuvering the ruler entirely. Finally, you pause at a hall of mirrors, reflections multiplying endlessly. Each image seems to represent a different court, a different rival, a different layer of intrigue. You feel the dizzying effect of centuries of strategy and cruelty folding in on themselves. And as you step forward, you carry with you the understanding that the queens you follow didn't merely react to threats, they anticipated, orchestrated, and often eliminated them with precision that was both brilliant and terrifying. Fear, in their hands, is an instrument, sharpened and tuned to perfection. The air changes again as you leave the halls of rivalry behind and step into spaces of obsession and control. Here, cruelty is personal, intimate, and often irrational, woven not from strategy alone, but from desire, jealousy, and a need for dominance that transcends political necessity. You wander along corridors lined with velvet and mirrors, where every reflection seems to measure the balance of power, vanity, and fear. You realize that some queens wielded cruelty as much to satisfy themselves as to maintain authority. The line between personal vendetta and political maneuver blurs until it vanishes entirely. You sense the intensity of obsession in the small details. One queen, you imagine, might have demanded daily reports from servants, not just on administrative matters, but on the behavior, demeanor, and even private conversations of her attendants. Scholars still argue whether these behaviors were symptoms of paranoia or shrewd management, but as you walk, the oppressive weight of scrutiny is palpable. Every gesture seems calculated, every pause deliberate, every word weighed for hidden meaning. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your awareness. Catherine de' Medici, after the death of her husband, was rumored to have orchestrated poisonings and intricate plots to eliminate political rivals and maintain her influence over France. You picture her in shadowed corridors, quietly observing, evaluating potential threats, and using fear as both shield and weapon. Even centuries later, the notion of such meticulous cruelty feels unnerving. Odd details flicker in the candlelight. Some queens reportedly used seemingly trivial objects as instruments of power. A jewel could mark favoritism or disdain, a cup of wine could symbolize trust or betrayal. You imagine yourself in these chambers, reading every gesture, interpreting every object, knowing that your survival could hinge on perceiving subtle signals. The absurdity and danger intertwine seamlessly, beauty and terror coexist in the same gesture. You wander toward private chambers where obsession transforms into ritualized cruelty. Courtiers and attendants are watched constantly, their behavior dissected for signs of weakness, rebellion, or disrespect. Even minor errors are magnified, shaping reputations and reinforcing authority. Scholars still debate whether these acts were born from insecurity, calculated strategy, or a combination of both, but the effect is indisputable. Terror becomes habitual, and loyalty is constantly tested. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens reportedly maintained elaborate punishments that mirrored their own anxieties. For instance, servants who failed to anticipate moods could face days of cold isolation, symbolic gestures that reinforced the queen's omnipotence while simultaneously addressing her personal fears. You feel the strangeness of it. The cruelty isn't just outward-facing, it is intertwined with the ruler's inner psychology, a reflection of their obsessions projected onto the court. You begin noticing the performative aspects of this cruelty. Private punishment often has echoes in public ceremonies, sending subtle messages without ever overtly displaying violence. A slight pause in conversation, a withheld compliment, or a delayed response can convey control, shame, or dominance. You shiver at the realization that such mastery of psychological manipulation could bend entire households to a single ruler's will without a single raised hand. The corridor narrows, drawing you toward a gallery filled with portraits of queens known for their jealous and obsessive tendencies. You linger over one, eyes sharp, lips tight, posture rigid. You imagine the countless hours spent observing, plotting, and manipulating those around her. Every detail of her expression communicates intent, strategy, and warning. Scholars still debate whether obsession necessarily leads to cruelty, but here, in this space, the connection seems inevitable. You sense the undercurrent of superstition woven into these acts. Some queens were convinced that certain rituals or punishments protected them from unseen threats, blending fear, obsession, and belief into a potent form of control. You imagine the attendants performing these rituals, their fear compounded by the mystical significance of their actions. The result is a court suspended between reality and perception, obedience enforced through both logic and dread. Finally, you pause at the threshold of the queen's personal study, where obsession and cruelty converge most intimately. You feel the weight of centuries of carefully directed psychological mastery, the meticulous orchestration of fear, and the relentless focus on controlling both allies and enemies alike. And as you step forward, you understand that the queens who thrived here didn't merely govern, they shaped minds, emotions, and perceptions with the same precision used to draw maps or compose laws. Their cruelty is intimate, pervasive, and unforgettable. You drift further into the shadows, leaving obsession behind and stepping into the cold corridors of reputation and infamy. Here, cruelty is not only personal, it's legendary. You feel it in the air, thick with the weight of stories repeated over centuries, tales of terror so persistent they blur fact and myth. You wander along halls lined with tapestries depicting queens whose very names inspire awe and dread. You realize that cruelty here isn't just action, it's narrative, legacy, and memory, carefully cultivated to ensure that fear lingers long after the queen is gone. A mainstream historical fact surfaces, sharp and undeniable. Mary I of England, dubbed Bloody Mary, became infamous for executing hundreds of Protestants in her effort to restore Catholicism, cementing her fearsome reputation. You picture the procession of prisoners, the silent crowd, the calculated formality of execution as both punishment and political statement. The room vibrates faintly with echoes of gasps, whispers, and prayers, and you feel the raw potency of cruelty wielded as a tool of history-making. Odd details creep in, almost like whispers in the corners. Some queens reportedly encouraged exaggerated rumors of their cruelty, spreading fear intentionally to prevent dissent without the need for direct action. You imagine court attendants passing these stories cautiously, and subjects flinching at shadows, unsure if the tales are true, or worse, if they might be. The psychological landscape of terror extends beyond the immediate palace walls, reaching every corner of the realm. You notice how reputation becomes currency. A queen's infamy protects her as much as her armies do. Scholars still argue whether reputations were carefully curated or inflated by gossip, but here, in these echoing corridors, it's clear that perception is as deadly as reality. Fear, after all, does not require proof, only belief. You feel it as a tangible force pressing against your shoulders, guiding every imagined decision and glance. You wander past portraits depicting dramatic scenes of past cruelty, their colors darkened with age. The paintings almost pulse with memory, prisoners kneeling, nobles cowering, crowds holding their collective breath. Even as a spectator, you feel the anxiety, the anticipation, the subtle lessons embedded in each image. It's a gallery of psychological warfare, a visual chronicle of the power of fear, carefully maintained over generations. A peculiar anecdote flits across your awareness. Some queens reportedly staged symbolic executions of effigies to send messages without harming a single human. You picture a marionette burning in the courtyard, the crowd's fear mingling with fascination. Scholars still debate whether these acts were genuinely effective or theatrical exaggerations, but you sense their brilliance. Cruelty, real or symbolic, leaves an indelible mark. The corridor narrows into a quiet library of documents, letters, and journals. You realize that written records were sometimes instruments of control, used to intimidate, manipulate, or discredit rivals. You imagine a queen poring over reports, annotating letters with subtle threats, arranging evidence to reinforce her dominance. Each document is a tool, a whisper, a weapon, part of an intricate system of fear and influence that extends far beyond personal presence. You feel the subtle interplay of truth and legend here. Stories of cruelty are repeated, enhanced, sometimes entirely fabricated, and yet they achieve the same effect: obedience. Scholars still argue about the line between myth and fact in historical accounts of queens' cruelty, but in this corridor, that line seems almost irrelevant. You experience the impact directly. Reputation can kill, manipulate, and inspire terror as effectively as any sword. Odd details continue to emerge. Some queens were said to keep albums of misdeeds, cataloging perceived betrayals or failures of loyalty to ensure that no one forgot their power, or their wrath. You imagine the meticulous care involved, the satisfaction derived from control maintained on paper, and the quiet dread such records would instill in anyone who might read them. Finally, you pause before a grand mirror reflecting not your own face, but a kaleidoscope of queens across time, each one staring back with icy precision. You feel the weight of their legacies, the meticulous crafting of fear, and the understanding that cruelty, when combined with perception, becomes immortal. And as you step forward, you carry with you the lesson that some queens understood the power of their reputation as a force more potent than armies, more enduring than decrees, and more terrifying than the sharpest blade. You drift further into corridors where cruelty has evolved into ritualized paranoia, where every interaction is a potential threat and every smile hides a trap. The air here is cooler, heavier, as if the palace itself remembers centuries of suspicion and plots. You feel eyes everywhere, real or imagined, tracking your movements, calculating your loyalty. This is the domain where queens mastered the delicate balance between vigilance and obsession, turning paranoia into an art form that ensured both control and survival. Odd details emerge like flickering candle flames. Some queens reportedly kept elaborate records of personal grievances and perceived slights, noting every minor offense as though plotting a future response. You imagine these journals, filled with tiny notations and coded warnings, sitting quietly on a polished desk, waiting for the moment when they could tip the scales of power. Scholars still debate whether this meticulous cataloging was strategic genius or a manifestation of personal obsession, but here, the effect is unmistakable: fear and uncertainty are tools in constant use. A mainstream historical fact enters your awareness. Isabella I of Castile consolidated her reign not only through conquest but by meticulously controlling her court and punishing dissenters, often using exile or imprisonment as deterrents. You picture the courtiers moving cautiously through her halls, each gesture calculated, each word measured, and the quiet dread that accompanies the constant threat of loss. You feel the weight of historical precedent pressing against your spine, teaching you that cruelty is often a craft honed over years, not a sudden act of malice. You wander past tapestries depicting battles, both on the field and in courts of intrigue. The imagery suggests that the greatest victories are often psychological rather than physical. You sense that in these halls, loyalty is never assumed, it is tested, manipulated, and reinforced through both fear and reward. Scholars still argue about the morality of these tactics, but as you navigate the corridors, morality seems almost irrelevant, effectiveness is all that matters. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens reportedly conducted elaborate psychological experiments on their subjects, testing obedience by creating scenarios of moral conflict or minor humiliation. You picture courtiers hesitating, unsure whether their decisions will earn favor or punishment, and realize that the true instrument of control is not physical dominance but the shaping of perception, anticipation, and self-doubt. The absurdity is striking, yet the stakes are life-altering. You move into a chamber filled with portraits of queens who thrived on paranoia and vigilance. Each painting captures a gaze that seems to follow you, a silent assertion of control that transcends time. You feel the quiet tension of surveillance, imagining that even centuries later, their strategies echo in the way people obey, fear, and anticipate. Scholars still debate how much of this behavior is innate versus learned from predecessors, but the power is unmistakable. The walls themselves seem to breathe, decorated with inscriptions and subtle carvings warning of loyalty, betrayal, and vigilance. Every detail reinforces the message. Nothing is hidden, nothing escapes notice, and power is maintained not only through action but through expectation. You sense the subtle psychological scaffolding that supports absolute authority, and you shiver at the precision with which fear is engineered. Oddly, some queens maintained loyalty tests for their attendants and advisors, tasks designed to expose dishonesty or lack of commitment. You imagine the anxiety such tests created, the meticulous observation required, and the silent dread that a misstep could mean ruin. Scholars still argue about the necessity and ethics of such practices, but the chilling effect on behavior is undeniable. Fear becomes instinctual, obedience automatic. Finally, you pause at the threshold of a grand balcony overlooking the gardens, a place where power is performed as much as observed. You sense the duality of cruelty and spectacle. The queen above, surveying her domain, confident that her influence extends everywhere, both in mind and in memory. And as you step forward, you understand that paranoia, carefully orchestrated and ritualized, is a form of mastery, one that ensures that both allies and enemies remain under her control, uncertain, watchful, and endlessly obedient. You step from the balcony into the chambers of decadence, where cruelty intertwines with indulgence and spectacle. Here, power is flaunted as much as it is enforced, and every luxury carries a subtle edge of intimidation. You wander past gilded furniture, velvet drapes, and crystal chandeliers, each object meticulously placed to impress, overwhelm, and, occasionally, intimidate. Scholars still argue whether these displays were primarily for diplomacy or domination, but as you walk, you feel the subtle tension, beauty and fear, comfort and dread, coexisting in perfect balance. A mainstream historical fact nudges your awareness. Queen Christina of Sweden, known for her eccentric lifestyle and defiance of gender norms, exercised authority through both lavish court entertainments and strict, often cruel, control of her advisors and servants. You imagine courtiers navigating her whims, aware that a misstep in etiquette or loyalty could invite ridicule, exile, or worse. The combination of charm, extravagance, and cruelty is disorienting, almost intoxicating, like walking through a dream where danger lurks beneath velvet cushions. Odd details flit at the edges of your perception. Some queens reportedly staged elaborate feasts where the subtle hierarchy of seating, the order of serving, or even the choice of wine communicated in spoken power dynamics. You picture yourself at one of these dinners, measuring every gesture, every glance, every sip, understanding that survival depends not just on politeness but on perception. The absurdity of it is almost comedic, except that the stakes are very real. You wander past corridors lined with mirrors and portraits, each reflecting both grandeur and subtle menace. You notice the way space itself is used as a psychological tool. Narrow hallways exaggerate posture, high ceilings create an air of smallness, and the layout of rooms forces subjects to pass through areas of observation. Scholars still debate whether these architectural choices were intentional or incidental, but you feel the effect. Intimidation is built into the very walls. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens maintained collections of exotic animals, not just as status symbols, but as instruments of fear. You imagine a lion pacing silently behind bars, a snake coiled in a corner, or a monkey trained to react sharply to intruders. The absurdity of it, almost theatrical, belies the psychological impact. The presence of these creatures communicates dominance, unpredictability, and danger in ways words cannot. You sense the rhythm of indulgence and cruelty intertwined. Lavish banquets, performances, and displays are interspersed with tests, reprimands, and carefully timed humiliations. You notice how anticipation and uncertainty amplify power. The queen who controls both pleasure and pain ensures that every moment is charged with psychological tension. Scholars still argue about the morality of these practices, but the effectiveness is undeniable. The corridor narrows toward a hidden chamber where the most intimate manipulations occur. You imagine whispered advice twisted into warnings, compliments layered with threats, and subtle gestures that communicate authority without a word. Here, cruelty becomes invisible, a shadow shaping thought, loyalty, and fear. You shiver, realizing that in such spaces, no one is ever truly unobserved. Oddly, some queens used seemingly trivial rituals to reinforce status. A fan waved at precisely the wrong moment, a curt nod, or a deliberately placed object could communicate displeasure or favoritism with deadly subtlety. You picture courtiers guessing, calculating, and constantly aware that a small misinterpretation could cost them dearly. The absurdity of it contrasts with the effectiveness, teaching you that mastery of cruelty often lies in details so small they almost go unnoticed. Finally, you pause at a window overlooking a courtyard where shadows of attendants and guards move like a living chessboard. You sense the choreography of power, every movement observed, every action weighed, every fear anticipated. And as you step forward, you understand that these queens turned indulgence into strategy, beauty into a weapon, and spectacle into a form of control that ensured their dominion extended beyond immediate presence into memory, imagination, and legend. You move into quieter corridors, where cruelty is less about spectacle and more about subtle influence. Here, power is maintained through manipulation of alliances, friendships, and intimacy. The air feels heavier, dense with the echoes of whispered confidences and carefully cultivated secrets. You wander past chambers where alliances were formed and broken with a glance or a word, where the fate of nobles and courtiers depended not on battle, but on perception, loyalty, and timing. Scholars still argue whether such manipulations were driven by survival instinct or innate cunning, but the effect is undeniable. Obedience is engineered through relationships as much as fear. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Empress Dowager Sachhi of China, while often criticized for her cruelty, skillfully managed court factions, punishing or promoting individuals to maintain dominance over a sprawling bureaucracy. You picture advisors trembling at her subtle glances, courtiers recalculating strategies with each shift of her attention. You realize that cruelty here is not dramatic, it is meticulous, precise, and psychological, delivered in ways that leave no visible mark but lasting consequences. Odd details flit at the edges of your vision. Some queens reportedly used seemingly mundane interactions, sharing a meal, handing a note, offering a compliment, as tests of loyalty or intelligence. You imagine the tension of attempting to interpret these gestures correctly, knowing that misreading a single signal could undo years of careful maneuvering. The interplay of ordinary action and latent danger is almost absurd, yet utterly effective in maintaining control. You wander past tapestries depicting historical victories and scenes of negotiation. Each thread is a reminder that power is reinforced not just through fear, but through perception. You sense the constant evaluation: who will bend, who will rebel, who can be trusted, and who will be quietly eliminated. Scholars still debate how much of this was instinct versus deliberate design, but the precision with which loyalty is observed and rewarded leaves no doubt that cruelty operates not only as punishment but as guidance. A peculiar anecdote emerges. Some queens reportedly maintained favor lists, cataloging courtiers according to perceived loyalty or usefulness. You imagine a carefully arranged ledger, names highlighted or crossed out, moods noted, subtle patterns tracked over time. It's a meticulous, almost obsessive exercise, but one that ensures the queen's influence extends into the smallest details of her subjects' lives. You shiver at the quiet, enduring power such documentation can command. You sense the rhythm of psychological dominance. Minor humiliations, subtle threats, or public praise wielded strategically to manipulate alliances and maintain authority. You notice that the threat of reward can be just as potent as the threat of punishment. Scholars still argue whether these tactics are morally defensible, but the effect is clear: obedience becomes habitual, and fear is only one instrument among many in the queen's arsenal. The corridor narrows as you approach a small antechamber, where private conversations and secret councils took place. You imagine delicate negotiations, whispered warnings, and instructions disguised as advice. The cruelty is invisible here, yet devastating, psychological, persistent, and precisely targeted. You realize that these queens understood human nature intimately, exploiting ambition, envy, and desire to shape outcomes without ever raising a hand. Oddly, some queens reportedly used minor errors as opportunities to assert dominance subtly. Perhaps a spilled cup, a mispronounced word, or a slight delay could be leveraged as evidence of incompetence or disrespect. You feel the tension that must have permeated daily life, the constant awareness that survival depends on perception, timing, and careful observation. The absurdity of such rules is tempered by their undeniable efficacy. Finally, you pause at a doorway opening into a garden courtyard, sunlight filtering through latticework. Here, the cruelty of influence becomes clear. Even in spaces of beauty and calm, power is exercised through attention, observation, and control of subtle dynamics. And as you step forward, you understand that these queens mastered the human psyche itself, turning relationships, gestures, and whispers into instruments of authority and fear, leaving subjects forever conscious of their presence, even when absent. You move into the quieter wings of the palace, where cruelty becomes ritualized, subtle, and almost ceremonial. Here, the act of ruling intersects with the art of control, and you feel the weight of tradition pressing down like an unseen hand. You wander past corridors lined with tapestries depicting ceremonies, coronations, and processions, each stitch reinforcing hierarchy, obedience, and vigilance. Scholars still argue whether ritualized cruelty was a practical tool for governance or an extension of personal whim, but as you walk, the impact is tangible, every motion is observed, every protocol enforced, and every deviation carries consequence. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your awareness. Maria Theresa of Austria, while celebrated for her reforms, was also known for meticulously enforcing court etiquette and punishing those who breached protocol, often through public admonishment or temporary exclusion. You picture courtiers standing rigidly, rehearsing gestures and greetings, aware that a single misstep could alter their fortunes. Even the most trivial actions were charged with political and personal significance, illustrating that cruelty is often embedded in the structures of daily life, not only in dramatic acts. Odd details catch your attention. Some queens reportedly staged ceremonies where minor courtiers were intentionally placed in awkward or humiliating positions, a reminder of their dependence on the ruler's favor. You imagine attending one of these events, careful to follow every subtle instruction, measuring every bow, nod, and gesture. The absurdity of it contrasts sharply with the anxiety it creates, revealing how ritual and performance can become instruments of control. You wander past libraries filled with manuscripts outlining etiquette, punishment, and hierarchy. Each book is a silent testament to the queen's authority, a blueprint for the subtle enforcement of obedience. Scholars still debate the balance between codified rules and the ruler's personal enforcement, but the precision of the system is undeniable. Fear, respect, and attention to detail are equally reinforced through ceremonial practice. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens reportedly used ceremonial dress codes to assert dominance, assigning colors, fabrics, and styles to signify rank or disfavor. You imagine a courtier hesitating over a hemline or sleeve length, aware that their choice could reflect loyalty or incur punishment. Even fashion becomes a tool of subtle terror, a constant reminder of the ever-present gaze of authority. You sense the rhythm of ritualized cruelty. Minor infractions, observed lapses, or forgotten gestures are amplified into lessons for the entire court. You notice that the combination of public visibility, symbolic punishment, and strict enforcement creates an environment where obedience becomes instinctive. Scholars still argue about the ethical implications, but you feel the psychological precision at work. The palace itself becomes a school of discipline and fear. The corridor narrows, leading to chambers where private audiences were held. You imagine the queen listening carefully, her reactions calculated, her responses measured to reinforce obedience and humility. Cruelty here is silent, psychological, and enduring, an invisible hand shaping behavior without a single physical mark. You shiver, sensing the quiet power of anticipation, suggestion, and measured disappointment. Oddly, some queens reportedly used staged scenarios to reinforce lessons learned during rituals, small exercises, pretend conflicts, or mock failures designed to test attentiveness and obedience. You envision courtiers rehearsing gestures, recalling lessons, and observing every subtle signal, the tension always lingering, never fully dissipating. The absurdity is tempered by the effectiveness. Ritualized cruelty embeds itself in memory and habit. Finally, you pause at a sunlit gallery overlooking the palace courtyard. Here, ceremonial display, observation, and control converge. You sense the subtle mastery of queens who used ritual to educate, manipulate, and instill obedience. Even in spaces of elegance and beauty, the mechanisms of fear and authority are at work, unseen yet profoundly felt. And as you step forward, you carry the understanding that cruelty, when woven into ceremony and expectation, becomes nearly invisible, powerful, enduring, and unforgettable. You drift into corridors where cruelty has become entwined with secrecy and surveillance. Here, the walls themselves seem alive, carrying whispers of betrayal, whispers of plots, and whispers of subjects trembling under a queen's unseen gaze. You sense the intensity of observation. Every glance, every gesture, every footstep could be recorded, noted, and later used to reward or punish. Scholars still argue whether surveillance was a tool of necessity or indulgence, but walking here, you feel it. Fear is omnipresent, silent, and meticulous. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Queen Anne of England, though often remembered for her personal struggles, maintained strict control over her court, using spies and confidants to monitor alliances and loyalty. You picture courtiers quietly reporting conversations, the subtle exchange of information forming invisible networks of control. The very act of observation becomes a tool of cruelty, ensuring that no action goes unnoticed and no ambition unchecked. Odd details emerge. Some queens reportedly used seemingly trivial household staff to act as informants, turning ordinary servants into instruments of control. You imagine a maid or a page standing silently, noting interactions, gestures, and whispers, while courtiers remain unaware that every move is under scrutiny. The absurdity of it contrasts sharply with the effectiveness. The palace itself becomes a stage for a psychological game of constant vigilance. You wander past corridors lined with tapestries depicting historical intrigues and whispered conspiracies. You sense that cruelty here is subtle but omnipresent. Betrayal, exposure, and manipulation are the instruments of power. Scholars still debate how much of the surveillance was formalized versus opportunistic, but the fear it generates is real and pervasive. You feel the tension in your chest, as though even the shadows might report on your imagined missteps. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens reportedly maintained secret codes or signals to communicate with allies and informants, ensuring messages could travel unnoticed and decisions made with precision. You envision courtiers decoding gestures, silences, or symbols, their anxiety constant, knowing that failure to interpret correctly could mean public embarrassment or exile. The blend of strategy and subtle terror is almost hypnotic, drawing you into the machinery of control. You notice how surveillance intertwines with paranoia. Even trusted advisors were sometimes tested or monitored, and minor errors were amplified into lessons for the entire court. Scholars still argue about the ethics and effectiveness of these measures, but you feel the psychological impact. Fear becomes a self-perpetuating force, ensuring loyalty without the need for overt punishment. The corridor narrows toward a chamber with thick drapes and discreet windows, designed for private observation of gatherings below. You imagine the queen watching quietly, noting posture, expressions, and whispered conversations. The act of being observed, though unseen, exerts a subtle yet powerful form of control. You shiver, aware that the queen's influence extends beyond what is visible, shaping behavior through anticipation and perception alone. Oddly, some queens reportedly created test scenarios where courtiers were unknowingly evaluated on loyalty, discretion, and prudence. You picture a minor faux pas magnified in memory, a whispered correction delivered days later, reinforcing obedience. Scholars still debate whether such tests were cruel or simply practical, but the effect is undeniable. Every subject becomes hyper-aware, molding behavior to avoid risk, real or imagined. Finally, you pause in a shadowed gallery, where portraits of queens known for surveillance and psychological mastery seem to watch you back. You feel the invisible threads of influence stretching across time, connecting ruler and subject in an unbroken chain of observation, expectation, and fear. And as you step forward, you understand that cruelty, exercised quietly through secrets and surveillance, can shape entire lives without a single raised hand, leaving subjects in a perpetual state of calculated anxiety and obedience. You move deeper into the labyrinth, where cruelty becomes entwined with legacy and memory. Here, the queen's influence extends far beyond her immediate court, echoing through generations, history books, and whispered stories. The air feels thick with anticipation, the weight of past actions pressing down as if the walls themselves are keeping score. You sense that survival is not only about navigating the present, but also about understanding the consequences that ripple outward, shaping reputations and histories long after the queen herself has passed. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Catherine the Great of Russia expanded her empire with brilliance and ruthlessness, quelling rebellions and punishing dissenters while carefully cultivating a narrative of enlightened authority. You imagine courtiers and subjects aware that their actions would echo into chronicles, letters, and reports, shaping how future generations would remember them. Cruelty here is strategic. It enforces obedience and crafts a legacy that ensures continued influence beyond death. Odd details appear like glimmers of candlelight. Some queens reportedly encouraged minutely exaggerated rumors about their acts of cruelty, allowing tales to grow in the telling. You picture peasants and courtiers alike discussing stories of merciless punishments or ingenious manipulations, unsure where fact ends and legend begins. Scholars still argue whether such tales were exaggerated for political effect or genuinely reflective of the ruler's actions, but you feel the power of fear magnified by memory. You wander past halls lined with portraits, each showing a queen in commanding posture, often surrounded by symbols of authority, power, and vigilance. You notice how imagery itself was a tool. Depictions of vigilance, decisiveness, and wrath served to remind both court and populace of the ruler's reach. Scholars still debate whether such visual propaganda was more about intimidation or artistry, but the psychological effect is immediate. Subjects are reminded constantly of the consequences of defiance. A peculiar anecdote surfaces. Some queens reportedly preserved artifacts of punishment, chains, documents, or even personal effects, as reminders of past lessons and warnings for future generations. You imagine walking through such collections, the objects silent yet imbued with authority, each one narrating a story of obedience reinforced through cruelty. The absurdity is almost poetic. Material objects become instruments of memory and control, binding the living to lessons learned by the past. You sense the rhythm of legacy-based cruelty. Actions, stories, and objects are all carefully curated to create an enduring impression, ensuring that fear and respect persist long after immediate threats are gone. Scholars still argue about the moral implications, but the effectiveness is undeniable. History itself becomes a tool of obedience, with memory as the instrument of power. The corridor narrows as you approach a balcony overlooking a vast courtyard where statues, fountains, and inscriptions silently convey authority. You imagine the queen stepping here, aware that every feature has been designed to reinforce her image and command. Even in absence, her presence dominates, ensuring that cruelty and expectation remain inescapable, woven into the fabric of daily life. Oddly, some queens reportedly commissioned theatrical reenactments of past punishments or triumphs, turning history into performance. You envision courtiers watching, tension coiling in every corner, aware that they are both spectators and participants in a living lesson on obedience. Scholars still debate whether such acts were intended primarily to educate or intimidate, but the psychological effect is clear. Fear and respect are reinforced simultaneously. Finally, you pause at the edge of a grand hall where banners and tapestries memorialize the deeds of queens past. You feel the weight of memory, the precision of stories told and retold, and the deliberate crafting of fear that ensures control stretches beyond the limits of life itself. And as you step forward, you understand that cruelty, combined with narrative and legacy, is immortal. It shapes perception, commands respect, and ensures that even long after a queen has gone, her influence remains absolute. You enter the final corridors, where cruelty blends with cunning, spectacle, and reflection. Here, you sense the totality of what you've witnessed. The obsession, paranoia, ritual, surveillance, indulgence, and legacy, all converging into a masterful display of control. The air feels charged, almost electric, as if the walls themselves retain the echoes of decades, sometimes centuries, of manipulation. You wander past chambers where queens honed the art of dominance, where every smile, gesture, and word was calibrated to reinforce their authority. Scholars still argue whether the most infamous acts were strategic or instinctual, but walking here, you feel the undeniable pattern. Cruelty, when wielded with precision, becomes power in its purest, most enduring form. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Queen Elizabeth I of England, renowned for her intelligence and political acumen, used both charm and calculated cruelty to maintain control over her court and navigate threats from rivals and foreign powers. You imagine her listening intently, issuing subtle reprimands or strategic favors, ensuring that obedience, loyalty, and fear remained perfectly balanced. It's a reminder that even the most composed monarchs maintained authority through a combination of intellect and intimidation. Odd details shimmer at the edges of perception. Some queens reportedly used small, almost playful acts, like a deliberately misplaced document or a staged misunderstanding, to remind courtiers that they were always being observed and that no gesture went unnoticed. You picture yourself tiptoeing through these spaces, aware that survival depends on constant awareness, a mental dance with uncertainty and calculation. You sense the rhythm of cruelty refined to its most subtle form. Every public act, private gesture, and ritualized movement carries meaning. Scholars still debate how much of this mastery was inherited, learned, or innate, but the psychological effect is undeniable. Obedience is internalized, fear is habitual, and influence becomes nearly invisible, yet omnipresent. You wander into an opulent gallery filled with portraits and artifacts from queens whose reputations still send shivers through history. You notice the interplay of beauty and menace, a lavish gown, a jeweled scepter, a delicate fan, all symbols of elegance that double as instruments of subtle intimidation. Oddly, some queens reportedly enjoyed watching reactions to their attire, testing the awareness and attentiveness of their court, turning every day into a performance of power. The corridor narrows into a quiet chamber, a place of reflection and strategy. You imagine the queen here, considering decisions, observing human behavior, and orchestrating both loyalty and fear with surgical precision. Scholars still argue about the ethical implications, but the lesson is clear. Cruelty, when combined with intelligence, patience, and psychological insight, becomes a tool of enduring authority. Finally, you pause at a window overlooking the palace gardens, bathed in soft twilight. You feel the culmination of everything you've witnessed. Obsession, paranoia, ritual, surveillance, indulgence, and legacy, all fused into a coherent system of dominance. And as you step forward, you understand that the most disturbingly cruel queens didn't merely rule, they shaped perception, manipulated human nature, and ensured that their influence extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Their cruelty was intimate, strategic, performative, and eternal. Now, as you leave the corridors of power behind, you step into a quieter, gentler space. The air softens, the shadows recede, and the intensity of centuries of observation, manipulation, and calculated cruelty begins to fade. You wander through gardens where moonlight glints off dewy leaves, where fountains murmur softly and a cool breeze brushes your skin. The echoes of strategy and fear dissolve into whispers of nature, reminding you that even the most enduring power eventually meets stillness. You notice the subtle beauty in the small things, the silver shimmer of a leaf, the gentle sway of a flower, the rhythmic trickle of water over stone. These simple details contrast sharply with the grandeur and terror you've witnessed, offering a quiet lesson in perspective. Even the most commanding figures eventually fade into memory, leaving only traces, stories, artifacts, and reflections that can be observed without fear. You breathe deeply, letting the tension ease from your shoulders. Perhaps you recall the faces, the eyes, the gestures of queens whose cruelty shaped empires. And yet, here in this calm, you sense that reflection itself is power, the ability to observe, understand, and release. You imagine stepping away from the weight of history, allowing the stories to rest as you rest, too. Softly, the palace lights dim in your imagination, and the distant hum of night embraces you. You feel the rhythm of the world slowing, each inhale and exhale grounding you in the present, far from intrigue and peril. The shadows no longer threaten, they are merely companions to your journey, gently reminding you of the night's passage. And as you drift toward quiet contemplation, you feel a whisper of comfort, the tales of cruelty are behind you, and the night stretches peacefully ahead. Sleep can now arrive, unhurried, as the soft murmur of gardens and distant stars accompanies you. Sweet dreams.